Paso Police Department. That includes the time he was there, why he left, and the discipline he faced. Remember, there were some questions about what was in the sheriff's resume. The sheriff had said it was a clerical error, and the correct resume is in his personal.
The night of January 31st, 2026, ended the way most evenings in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona always did, quietly. The kind of quiet that comes from wide desert lots, long private driveways, and neighbors who have lived behind iron gates long enough to stop noticing them. It was the kind of neighborhood where residents measured safety not in locks, but in decades of routine. Nothing had ever happened here. Nothing ever needed to. At approximately 9:50 that evening, Nancy Guthrie was dropped off at her home by her son-in-law, Tommaso Sioni. She was 84 years old. She lived alone. She was, by every account, a woman who kept her own schedule, managed her own life, and needed no one to check on her. That night, she walked through her front door the same way she had thousands of times before. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. The following morning, Nancy did not appear for a scheduled live stream of a church service. Something she did regularly. A member of her congregation contacted the family. Relatives arrived at the home around 11 a.m., searched the house and surrounding property, and found nothing. Her phone was still inside. Her essential items were still inside. Nancy Guthrie was not. Around noon, the family called 911. What followed would not stay local for long. Within days, this quiet neighborhood in southern Arizona would become the center of one of the most closely watched missing persons cases in the country, a case that would raise hard questions not just about what happened to one woman, but about the very system that was supposed to find her. Bloodstains recovered at the residence were confirmed to be Nancy's. Evidence at the scene indicated she had been taken against her will. This was not a case of a confused elderly woman wandering off.
They treated the scene like a search and rescue mission, a decision that Enton's reporting suggests may have been the investigation's first and most critical mistake.
Investigators knew it almost immediately. And yet, 70 days later, as of this recording, Nancy Guthrie has not been found. No arrest has been made. No suspect has been publicly named. But here is what has happened. The sheriff leading this investigation is now himself under threat of removal from office. His own deputies voted against him, unanimously. A federal deadline was issued. A recall campaign launched. And buried inside all of it, two completely opposite statements from law enforcement about how close, or how far, they actually are from finding answers. This is a real, ongoing case involving a vulnerable person. Some of what is reported here may be difficult to hear. Everything stated in this documentary is drawn from verified, publicly reported sources. Hi viewers. Before we go any further into what investigators found at that house, and what they may have already known before the public was told anything, tell me in the comments, when you first heard about this case, what was the one detail that stopped you cold? Nancy Guthrie is the mother of NBC News journalist and Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, who stepped away from her broadcasting duties, including planned coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics, to assist in the search for her mother. That single fact brought this case into living rooms across the world. But the story that was building inside the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the story the cameras couldn't fully see, that is where this documentary begins. Multiple ransom notes of undetermined origin had demanded payment in cryptocurrency, with two deadlines that passed by February 9th. Notes kept coming. Tips by the tens of thousands flooded in. A reward grew to over $1 million. Expert search teams from across the country offered to help. And according to multiple reports, at least some of that help was turned away. The question everyone kept asking was simple: why? Retired FBI Special Agent Scott Organbaum offered one possible answer, that in cases where law enforcement has a credible suspect, they often cannot disclose that information to the public for fear of compromising the investigation. That would mean the silence was not failure. It would mean the silence was strategy. But an insider source told journalist Brian Entin something very different, that at that same point in time, there was no direct suspect identified at all. Two statements. Two completely different realities. One missing woman.
TMZ has just reported that they have received another ransom letter.
And a sheriff whose own department had already begun to fall apart around him. The answers to what truly happened on the night of February 1st, 2026, are still locked somewhere inside this case. And when they finally come out, they may change everything the public thought it understood. When family members arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st, 2026, they searched the house and the surrounding property. What they found, or rather, what they did not find, set the tone for everything that came after. No signs of a struggle visible from the outside. No broken windows. No obvious forced entry. Just a house that looked exactly the way it always did, except the woman who lived inside it was gone. Deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department responded to the 911 call placed around noon that day. Among the first things they noted, Nancy's phone, her personal belongings, her essential items, all still inside the home. She had not packed. She had not planned to leave. Whatever happened inside that house happened fast, and it happened to someone who had no reason to expect it. This was the foundation the investigation was built on. Unlike many foundations in this case, it would later prove to be more complicated than it first appeared. Evidence recovered at the residence indicated that Nancy Guthrie had been taken against her will. Bloodstains found at the scene were confirmed to be hers. The Pima County Sheriff, Chris Nanos, stated publicly that he believed she had been abducted. That word, abducted, changed the weight of the entire case. This was no longer a welfare check. This was a crime scene. A multi-agency investigation took shape quickly, led by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, with assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and search and rescue teams. The effort included extensive forensic analysis, neighborhood canvassing, and review of surveillance footage. On the surface, that reads like a coordinated, professional response. But the details that emerged in the days and weeks that followed told a more layered story. Reports surfaced suggesting that in the earliest hours of the investigation, the case was not immediately treated as a criminal abduction.
Every supervisor on that board, including the most conservative member, they formally served Sheriff Chris Nanos with a sworn set of questions under Arizona Revised Statute Section 11-253A. The statute is not ambiguous.
According to later accounts, early decisions were guided by a framework more consistent with a missing person scenario, a classification that carries a very different level of urgency than a confirmed kidnapping. In any investigation, the first hours are the ones that matter most. Resources, focus, and direction set in those early hours can determine whether a case moves forward or stalls before it begins. Gloves recovered near Nancy Guthrie's home, along with biological material found on the porch, both tested positive for DNA. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that DNA evidence was being sent to multiple labs across the country for testing. The process, investigators acknowledged, takes time. By late March, Sheriff Nanos confirmed that investigators had expanded their focus, highlighting the evening of January 11th, 3 weeks before the disappearance, as a date of particular interest. Authorities were requesting footage, records, and observations from anyone within a 2-mile radius of Nancy's home spanning from January 1st through February 2nd. That detail stopped a lot of people. January 11th. 3 weeks before Nancy vanished. That is not the behavior of investigators looking for someone who was taken randomly. That is the behavior of investigators who believed this was planned, and planned for some time. Sheriff Nanos himself would later state that investigators now believe something may have happened weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home. The word "targeted" began appearing more frequently in official statements. This was not a crime of opportunity. Whoever was responsible had, at some point, made a decision about this specific woman, in this specific house, on a quiet street in the Catalina Foothills. That raises a question that investigators were certainly asking, and one the public was asking just as loudly: who? On the evening of February 10th, a person of interest was detained for questioning following a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona, approximately 60 miles south of Tucson. Shortly after, the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI executed a search warrant on a property and vehicle in the same area. By February 11th, those searches had concluded, and the individual was released without charges. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that the person was determined not to be involved in the disappearance. A lead. A search. A release. And then silence again. On February 13th, the Sheriff's Department began an operation at a residence approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. 2 individuals were removed from the property, and surrounding roads were closed to the public for nearly 4 hours. No charges were announced. No connection to the case was publicly confirmed. Every time the investigation seemed to be moving towards something, stopped just short of the edge. Multiple ransom notes of undetermined origin demanded payment in cryptocurrency. 2 deadlines contained in those notes had already passed by February 9th. Then more notes came. By early April, TMZ reported receiving a demand letter with claims about Nancy Guthrie's condition and location. The notes demanded Bitcoin in exchange for information. TMZ founder Harvey Levin described the communications as potentially intended to torment the family rather than provide verifiable proof of her well-being, though their authenticity had not been publicly verified by law enforcement. This marked at least the 3rd set of such demands since the disappearance, with earlier notes also referencing cryptocurrency payments. Authorities neither confirmed nor denied the validity of any of the notes. That silence, deliberate, carefully maintained, was its own kind of message. It told the public that law enforcement either could not verify what was being received, or would not say. On February 18th, Google announced that it was working to extract additional footage from various home cameras in the area. Technology was being pulled in. Every frame of footage, every angle of every camera within range, was being reviewed. And still, nothing that moved the case to a public breakthrough. By mid-March, the intense media and law enforcement presence that had descended on the Catalina Foothills had largely pulled back. The neighborhood, once filled with news crews and investigators, had gone quiet again. But the community had not returned to the way it was before. Residents described a permanent shift in how they moved through their own neighborhood. Women who once walked freely now thought twice. Neighbors who had never worried about their surroundings were discussing safe rooms. "I don't feel the same anymore," said one local business owner near the foothills. If it can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. That is what an unresolved case does to a community. It does not just take one person. It takes the sense of safety from everyone who remains. And through all of it, Nancy Guthrie's family kept asking the same thing. In a statement posted in late March, they wrote, "We desperately ask this community for renewed attention to our mom's case." No detail is too small. It may be the key. The investigation was pressing forward. The family was pressing forward. But the man responsible for leading that investigation, Sheriff Chris Nanos, was facing a pressure of an entirely different kind. Because while all of this was unfolding publicly, something was happening inside his own department that the cameras had not fully caught yet. And when it finally came to the surface, it would raise questions not just about this case, but about whether the institution trusted to solve it was capable of doing so at all. By March 2026, the Nancy Guthrie investigation had been running for more than 6 weeks. Tips had come in by the tens of thousands. Federal agents were embedded in the case. A reward had grown to over $1 million. The public had donated, shared, searched, and waited. And yet, quietly, the story was shifting. The missing woman at the center of it all had not been found. But the man in charge of finding her was rapidly becoming a story of his own. Amid national pressure over the Pima County Sheriff's Department's handling of the Nancy Guthrie case, Sheriff Chris Nanos found himself facing a recall effort. That alone would have been significant. But the recall was only the most visible part of what was happening. Inside the department, the pressure had reached a level that law enforcement agencies almost never allowed to become public. The Pima County Deputies Organization, the group representing the men and women who work under Sheriff Nanos every single day, took a step that is extraordinarily rare in law enforcement. They held a formal vote of no confidence in their own sheriff. And the result was not close. According to reports, the vote was unanimous. 100% of participating deputies cast their vote against the man leading the department. A no-confidence vote does not remove a sheriff. But it says something that no press release or public statement can walk back. It says that the people closest to the operation, the ones who see how decisions are made, how priorities are set, how the department actually functions from the inside, no longer trust the person at the top. That vote was cast on March 24, 2026. In the middle of an active federal investigation. In the middle of a nationally watched missing persons case. At the worst possible moment for public confidence in the department. Questions about Sheriff Nanos had not started with the Guthrie case. Reports had surfaced about his prior employment at the El Paso Police Department, questions about his resume, about disciplinary actions from that period, and about statements made in relation to that history. Those questions had circulated before February 1st. Before Nancy Guthrie's name was known outside of her own community. 2 individuals connected to the sheriff had also taken legal action. Heather Lappin, who had run against Nanos in the 2024 election for Pima County Sheriff, filed a federal lawsuit alleging retaliation. A deputy named Aaron Cross faced disciplinary action after publicly protesting the sheriff's conduct. These were not anonymous complaints from the outside. These were people with direct knowledge of the department, making formal, documented claims. Then there was the airport incident. On November 6, 2024, more than a year before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Sheriff Nanos was reported to have carried a loaded, undeclared firearm through a security checkpoint at Tucson International Airport. The weapon reportedly had a round in the chamber. No charges were filed. For many observing the case from the outside, that incident had become a symbol. Not of one isolated lapse, but of a pattern where accountability moved differently depending on who was holding the position. Sheriff Nanos warned publicly that the suspect involved in the Nancy Guthrie case could strike again, and that there could be a danger to the public. That statement was significant. It confirmed, in official terms, that investigators believed whoever was responsible was still at large, still capable, and possibly not done. But it also created a new layer of tension. Because the same official issuing that warning was the one whose leadership was being formally questioned by his own department, his own deputies, and now, the county's governing body. Retired FBI Special Agent Scott Orgenbaum, speaking about the investigation's pace, made a point that many in law enforcement would echo. Sometimes these cases take a long time. And I know it's very difficult to tell people to be patient, but at this time, law enforcement has a job to do, and we need to let them do their job. He added that he had worked on several cases where a clear suspect existed, but information was deliberately kept from the public to avoid compromising the case. That framing offered one possible explanation for the silence. That the investigation was further along than it appeared. That the quiet was not absence of progress, but the shape of progress itself. But journalist Brian Entin, who had been reporting closely on the case, cited a law enforcement source stating the opposite, that at that point in the investigation, no direct suspect had been identified. 2 sources. 2 completely different pictures of the same investigation. And no way for the public to know which one was true. Meanwhile, the family released a statement in late March asking the community for renewed attention. No detail is too small. It may be the key, they wrote. They were asking for footage, text messages, journal notes, conversations, anything that, in hindsight, might carry meaning. That appeal said something important. After more than 6 weeks, with federal resources, over $1 million in reward money, and thousands of tips already processed, the family was still reaching back out to ordinary people. Still asking for help. Still waiting. And the sheriff leading all of it with one vote away from the most serious official consequence of his career. On April 7, 2026, the Pima County Board of Supervisors convened for a closed session. The meeting lasted 4.5 hours. When it ended, the outcome was announced, a unanimous 5-0 vote. Under an Arizona statute that carries serious legal weight, Sheriff Nanos was served with a formal set of legal questions. He was given a deadline to respond, 10 business days, placing the cutoff at April 21, 2026. The areas of inquiry covered his employment history, prior disciplinary actions, communications related to immigration enforcement, and departmental budget matters. Under Arizona law, failure to provide adequate answers within the deadline could open the path toward removal from office. The man investigating a kidnapping was now himself the subject of a formal legal process. The timeline of both situations was now running at the same time, the search for Nancy Guthrie, and the potential removal of the sheriff overseeing it. Whatever happened next, the case had become something larger than a disappearance. It had become a test of whether the institution responsible for solving it could hold itself together long enough to do so. And the deadline was approaching fast. April 21, 2026 was a date that carried two different kinds of weight. For Nancy Guthrie's family, every date that passed without answers was another day added to an already devastating count. For the Pima County Board of Supervisors, April 21st was the legal deadline by which Sheriff Chris Nanos had to respond to the formal questions served to him following their unanimous vote. Two countdowns, running side by side, with no guarantee either would resolve cleanly. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had by this point produced a record that was, by most accounts, without clear precedent in southern Arizona. Over the course of the investigation, multi-agency task force had processed tens of thousands of tips, executed multiple search warrants, reviewed surveillance footage across an entire neighborhood, and sent DNA evidence to labs in multiple states. The family had offered a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. That number had drawn attention from across the country. Former law enforcement professionals, retired investigators, private analysts, all had weighed in publicly. Some offered theories. Some offered criticism of how the case had been handled. Others simply pointed to the evidence and said, this case is not straightforward. Private analysts and former FBI agents speculated on possible motives ranging from financial gain to personal connections, but no theory had been confirmed. The ransom notes demanding cryptocurrency had complicated the picture further. Were they authentic communications from someone with knowledge of Nancy's location? Were they opportunistic attempts to extract money from a high-profile family in crisis? Law enforcement would not say. The notes kept coming, and the answers did not. The latest set of communications, reportedly received around April 6th, the same day Savannah Guthrie returned to the anchor desk at the Today Show, claimed knowledge of Nancy's whereabouts and demanded Bitcoin payment in exchange for information. Savannah Guthrie had stepped away from her NBC duties for nearly 2 full months. When she returned on April 6th, her first words to viewers were simply, "Good morning, welcome to Today on this Monday morning. We are so glad you started your week with us, and it is good to be home." She said it was good to be home. But home, the real one, the one that mattered most, was still out of reach. Against all of this, the investigation continued to produce signals that contradicted each other in ways that were difficult to reconcile. On one side, Sheriff Nanos had stated publicly that the department believed it was getting closer. He had warned that the suspect could be a danger to the public and could potentially act again, language that carries a very specific meaning in law enforcement. You do not issue the kind of public warning unless you have reason to believe the threat is real and ongoing. On the other side, a source speaking to Brian Entin described a situation with no direct suspect in sight. Retired FBI agent Scott Orgenbaum offered the framework that many investigators operate within when a case reaches this point. There's a lot of investigation going on behind the scenes, and you really don't know what's going on. If law enforcement has a really good suspect at this time, they are not going to be able to tell the public. That statement became one of the most analyzed pieces of commentary in the entire case, because it explained the silence in a way that was credible. And it left open the very real possibility that everything the public had been told, or not told, was part of a careful, deliberate strategy. Meanwhile, the political situation around Sheriff Nanos had reached a point where it could no longer be separated from the investigation itself in the public conversation. The recall effort, the no confidence vote, the Board of Supervisors' formal legal demand. All of it happening while the case was still active, still open, still demanding everything the department had. Expert search teams, including organizations with deep experience in missing persons cases, had offered to assist in the search for Nancy Guthrie. According to reports, those offers were not taken up. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffin-Duffer offered an interpretation that several observers found compelling, that rejecting outside search assistance can sometimes indicate that investigators have already moved beyond the search phase. That the focus had shifted from where someone might be found to who was responsible for taking them. If that reading was accurate, it meant the investigation was further along than it appeared. If it was not accurate, it meant opportunities for help had been passed over during a critical window. There was no official explanation either way. What is documented is this: as of early April 2026, after 60+ days, there had been no arrests and no suspects publicly named. The investigation remained active. The family continued to ask for help. The DNA evidence continued to be processed. And law enforcement continued to say that every tip, every lead, and every piece of footage still mattered. 3 timelines were now running simultaneously. The investigation into what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the formal legal deadline facing Sheriff Nanos, and the recall campaign building in the background, requiring roughly 120,000 signatures by mid-July to move forward. Each of those timelines carried its own stakes. Each of them could break in a way that changed everything. And the one person at the center of all 3, not Nancy, not Nanos, but the truth itself, had not yet been reached. The answers were out there. Investigators believed that. The family believed that. And the question was no longer whether this case would break open. The question was when, and what it would look like when it did. There are cases that end with clarity. Arrests, charges, answers delivered in press conferences with faces and names and timelines. Cases where the system, imperfect as it is, produces an outcome that gives a family something solid to stand on. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, as of this documentary, has not reached that point. As of April 9, 2026, Nancy Guthrie has not been located. The investigation remains ongoing. Law enforcement has stated that her condition and whereabouts remain unknown. Day after day, the count has continued. More than 70 days. A woman who raised 3 children, built a life across 5 decades in the Tucson area, and was known by everyone close to her as warm, steady, and independent, still gone. Still without answers. Her family, law enforcement, and the public continue to wait, united in a plea for her safe return. What this case has produced, beyond the investigation itself, is a hard, documented look at what happens when a crisis arrives and the institution handling it is already under pressure from within. The Pima County Sheriff's Department took on one of the most closely watched missing persons cases in Arizona's recent history while simultaneously managing an internal collapse that would have challenged any organization. The deputies voted. The board acted. A legal deadline was set. And through all of it, the investigation continued. Because it had to, because a woman's life may depend on it. New ransom-style communications kept arriving. New leads kept being processed. New surveillance footage kept being reviewed. The case did not stop moving. But it also had not, as of this recording, arrived at the answer everyone was waiting for. The family's public statement in late March said it plainly: no detail is too small. It may be the key. That sentence carries the full weight of what they have been living through. Not asking for miracles. Not demanding results on a specific day. Just asking that no one stop looking. No one stop paying attention. No one file this case away as too difficult or too old or too complicated to matter. In the Catalina Foothills, residents who once moved through their neighborhood without a second thought now describe the permanently altered sense of their surroundings. The yellow ribbons outside Nancy's home kept accumulating. The memorial at her gate became a quiet, ongoing statement from a community that refused to move on without resolution. Law enforcement professionals who have followed the case consistently make the same point, that patience, in cases like this, is not passive. It is an active part of the work. Evidence is being processed. Labs are running tests. Databases are being checked. The investigation is not dormant. It is moving through channels the public cannot see. But the accountability dimension of this case will also continue to move forward regardless of what the investigation produces. The sheriff's deadline passed or will pass. The recall effort is either building toward its signature threshold or it is not. The legal and political consequences for one of the state's most prominent law enforcement officials are still being determined, in real time, by events that have not yet concluded. What this documentary has reported is the documented record of this case as it stands, the evidence collected, the leads pursued, the missteps reported, the family's appeals, the internal department conflict, and the institutional pressure that converged around all of it simultaneously. Nancy Guthrie is not a case number. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman of faith, a widow who built her life with her own hands after losing her husband at 49 years old. She is described by those who know her as warm and resilient. She has lived most of her life in Tucson. She deserves to be found. The investigation is not over. The questions are not closed. And this story, the full story, with all of its answers, is still being written. When those answers come, they will matter. Not just for one family in southern Arizona, but for every person who followed this case, who shared it, who asked the questions that kept it from fading from public view. Because the pressure of an informed public is one of the things that keeps these investigations moving when everything else slows down. If this case matters to you, and if you have watched this far, it clearly does, then stay connected. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there are more stories coming that deserve the same attention, the same level of scrutiny, and the same refusal to look away. Stories of real people, real consequences, and real questions that need real answers. Share this video. Leave your thoughts below. Your voice in the comments is not just engagement, it is part of how stories like this one stay alive long enough to reach resolution. Nancy Guthrie's family is still waiting. The investigation is still open. And somewhere in this case, the truth is still there, waiting to be found.